in situ conservation is majorly dealt in Article 8 of the Convention on Biodiversity. The Convention on the Article 8 kind of talk about the various methods of conservation, in situ conservation, and how to address different threats to in situ conservation. For instance, how what about the activities and the processes that kind of adversely impact the biodiversity conservation have to be handled, or I mean the states have the mandate to handle those control those activities. All these things are mentioned in Article 8 also. Article 8 specifically talks about establishing a network of protected areas important for conservation within protected areas important for conservation. It also talks about promoting environmental sound and sustainable development of areas adjacent to protected areas. It talks about how to handle and manage living modified organisms which might have adverse impact on the environment and also on human health. It talks about activities and processes which has adverse impact on conservation and sustainable use. It also talks about Article 8J talks about how to protect and respect the practices and knowledge of indigenous and local communities whose lifestyle have been relevant for conservation and sustainable use. So this is like the main contents of Article 8, and Article 9 deals with ex situ conservation, which we have already discussed. Ex situ conservation is nothing but conservation of species outside their natural surroundings. So if you see how India has kind of adopted these provisions, we already have a wide range of environmental, forest and wildlife legislations. For instance, we have the umbrella legislation of Environmental Protection Act, which deal with environmental impact assessment of development projects. We have an EIA notification in 1992, which is now de-notified in 2006. And we have also rules regulating the biosafety, rules regulating the genetically modified organisms, which was passed in 1989 under the Environmental Impact Assessment, Environmental Protection Act. We also have pollution laws relating to air pollution, water pollution, and what to do with all those pollution that have created from industries and other activities. As already discussed, the Biological Diversity Act is a primary act that kind of deal with all these things, but a lot of its provisions have already been addressed in different legislations. For instance, we have established a network of protected areas under the Wildlife Protection Act in 1972, and we have different protected area categories like national parks, sanctuaries, community reserves, conservation reserves, and also other areas that are demarcated for conservation of different species, like we have tiger reserve, we have programs, different programs for elephant conservation, we have tiger reserves, and there are other policies and laws, regulations which deal with conservation. For instance, we have certain legislations for or policies for wetland conservation, etc. So we already have enacted a network of conservation laws, that is for under the Wildlife Protection Act, which has categories of protected areas like national parks, sanctuaries, conservation reserves, community reserves, and the categories of demarcated areas for protection outside this network of protected area, because Wildlife Protection Act has a definition for protected area, but we have elephant reserves, we have tiger reserves, we have other protected areas, and also we have different policies for conservation, like we have wetland conservation policies and etc. So we already have a set of rules and regulations and legislation that address a lot of aspects that is there already in Article 8, and also the provision, the sections in Biological Diversity Act. So, but now what we need to look at is what is a kind of a type of approach towards conservation in all those wildlife laws. It was earlier when you say we had categories of protected areas like national parks and sanctuaries. So when you establish a national park or sanctuaries, it was you never went and asked for consent of the communities that are living there or that are being protecting these areas. So the provisions were like you notify that area and then you settle all the rights, which basically means that the communities living in those areas will not continue to enjoy those rights. So they have to be relocated, their rights have to be settled, and they have to be displaced. While this system of conservation or approach of conservation was exclusionary in nature, and it was a top-downist approach. This has been really criticized in by many, and the approach slightly shifted, and we have adopted joint forest management. We have adopted new categories into the protected area definitions like community reserves, conservation reserves. We've already also passed a legislation which is the Scheduled Tribes and the Other Forest Dwellers Recognition of Rights legislation, that is known as the Forest Rights Act in 2006. This legislation kind of give the tribal communities their right to depend and live in the protected areas, live in the forest, continue to use the resources for their livelihood and also for their some kind of other uses. And also it gave them the right to protect and conserve and manage those forest resources that they have been traditionally conserving. So now you just don't have you have both state control over the protected areas, and you also have provisions for communities conserving the certain areas, which we already know that it includes your conservation reserves. It includes your community reserves, which is basically private lands. It also includes community forest reserves, which is a right that the forest dwelling communities have obtained from the Forest Rights Act to conserve, protect, manage the forest resource. And another thing, another protected area kind of classification can be found in Biological Diversity Act, that is for biodiversity rich areas. You can notify those areas as biodiversity heritage sites. So we already have all these protected areas, and now we have a slight change in our approach also from an exclusionary approach towards conservation. We are kind of including communities who have been already protecting these, and now it has become an inclusive approach towards conservation also. So that's how the conservation aspect of our of the Indian legal system goes.